Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Stephen Steyer. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Hi, Paul. Walaikum salam. Good to be back.
Great to have you back, sir. Now, the issue by which our age will likely be judged by future generations is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And here with me today to discuss the Jimmy Carter position is Dr. Stephen Steyer, former lecturer at Oxford University, where he taught courses on classical Islam and religions. His research is focused on Islamic education as well as tradition and modernity. This podcast is the second part of Dr. Stephen's thoughts on Jimmy Carter and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Since we recorded the video, which, by the way, is in the link is in the description below, President Jimmy Carter sadly passed away, and his state funeral was on January the 9th. Carter was not merely another voice, but a former president of the United States whose interest in the topic was not merely while in office or to please fickle voters. His Christian position is a testament to how current US government positions have departed from a previous consensus and why that is. It's also a Christian perspective on how one can support and remain sympathetic to Jews and Israel, yet follow the ethical evidence wherever it leads, even to condemnation and pressure to change policy. Carter, speaking of matters before October the 7th, largely blames a weak US stance for the deterioration of the situation, human rights abuses, blood spilt in the Holy Land, and the two-state solution becoming more and more unrealizable. So Dr. Stephen Steyer continues his reflections today. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. We're here to also complete the summary and of Carter's book on the conflict, and the timing couldn't be more significant with the death of Jimmy Carter, 39th President of the United States. And the honoring of him across the United States, but also across the world at the moment, still carrying on, and the inauguration of Donald Trump, the 45th and 47th president. So before picking up with the summary, I'll say a word on Carter and Trump, and then turn to three crucial historical lessons that must be captured from this book going forward to avoid disaster. Okay, so in the inauguration speech, Trump said he was going to stop World War III. In Carter's time, World War III was the closest it had ever been when the USSR and the US met in the Sinai Peninsula, dragged into it from Egypt and Israel. So starting with the personal lessons that we should take from Jimmy Carter, it is his attributes, right? His righteousness, his compassion, his bravery, and his humility. So when releasing his book at Brandeis University, he reminded those in attendance that he had counted the number of times that the word righteous or righteousness occurred in the Old and New Testaments in order to reflect on the importance of the word in Scripture, right? And the said qualities gave him the capacity to choose ethics over cynical power politics, and it allowed him to implement the biblical wisdom of listening to both sides before pronouncing on a judgment. And he had the bravery to engage with the enemies that were inevitably produced by him engaging honestly in the process. So to talk about Trump just for a moment here and contextualize this, his ambassador that presided over the notorious negotiations that have been dragging on since May, if you look at the difference in result, because as you mentioned, Carter is really implicating the United States here for a lot of reasons, not simply that they could, no one wants to say force the hand, right? But just to talk about Trump here and his position, President Biden, in spite of words to the effect that he wants to do something, proved utterly impotent. And sometimes people's actions not just speak louder than words, but they betray what they really believe. I don't know in this case, of course. The cost was that since May, over 10,000 additional Palestinian lives were lost, mostly women and children, in spite of the fact that the contract that was signed is exactly the same. Probably more hostages would have gone home. So while Trump can certainly spin an ideology, I'm not saying he can't, we hope that there's less of a deep, cynical ideology than Biden entertained, a power politics that subverts truth, religion, and history to power. And there is a movement that I ascribe to of truth and justice, which is, it's not about my tribe versus your tribe and who I'm siding with, right? If I believe that my tribe is wrong, then I'll support your so-called tribe, right? So we have to be very serious about truth and justice. And when we take an issue like this and don't deal with the truth and the facts and the history, and that's really all I'm speaking about today is the history, you get ethics, which without truth becomes sentimentalism. And people very often lead or produce actively the worst types of self-contradictions when they don't have a principled ethics based on truth. They turn from saint to tyrant in the bat of an eyelash. And politics without truth is sheer evil, self-serving power. And religion without truth is political theology, where elements of scripture are carelessly and opportunistically lifted from the holy pages and applied to the very less than holy political realities in front of us, in a way that traditionally or historically, all three of the Abrahamic faiths, the Christian church, Judaism, and Islam, live to regret when they make this type of political theology. So we need a voice that we can trust. If I knew a better voice that can actually lead to belief than Jimmy Carter, that's what I would look for. So I'm happy to have found his book and spent time with it, as you know, it's 250 some pages.
Can we just see the cover again? Can you just hold it up for the
yes, yeah. Camera? Now later in some of the slides I have
oops, let me do that again. There we are. Peace, peace. You can hold it up a bit higher. Peace, Palestine.
Yeah, peace, not apartheid.
Yeah, a great title. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and it has to be perceived in a subtle way. He spoke about the choice of the words at Brandeis. I'm happy to come back to that later, but effectively what he's saying is not apartheid. So he's not, although he does actually believe that the definition of apartheid does apply, whatever one's reasons for that or excuses for falling into that type of situation and treatment. But for everyone going forward, there are three historical lessons that it's crucial to take from Carter at this very juncture. There's no time to dilly about, because anyone that watched the inauguration speech realizes that even since the speech, how many orders have been signed, right? So things are going to be moving very quickly. So number one, Carter saw that as a Christian, the only way to end the conflict in the Middle East is not really a mystery, right? It's reprinted in his book. It's called UN Resolution 242. Israel and Palestine exist in their legal borders established in 1967. And this, I'll always be clear what is a comment from me. Anyone who would resist this needs to already realize that Israel is the winner there, because they're taking 78% of the land, and Palestinians retain what was promised by the 1948 partition as well, right? Which is full autonomy in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So this type of a deal is called land for peace, and in the sense that Israel occupied these three territories at the end of a war, they're returning it, which is they're legally obliged to do anyway. In return, so they're not giving it away for nothing. they're giving it away for their the acknowledgement of them to exist. And just to throw in quickly, we can come back to it, but having spent time with discussing these matters with Americans, they tend to come back to what we call, talking points, basically. And so a very important one in this situation is that they will say, well, Hamas doesn't acknowledge the right of Israel to exist. And they don't bother to read the charter, or they'll pull something out that was published in the 1980s, right? So the Guardian, the London newspaper, has an article establishing when and how their charter was changed. And there are points that Carter will get to as well, where he quotes Yasser Arafat and denies these accusations, right? Because it's an emotional thing. They want Americans to feel that this is an oppressed people, and their back is against the wall, right? And that it opens. Paul, I know that you've had the scholar and philosopher Hassan Spiker on before, and the structure of Western liberal democracy, like Carl Schmitt would say, it has this security backdoor, right? So it's not a deep, rich tradition in the sense that it kind of emerged, at the hands of John Locke and people that are relatively recent, and they're sort of quickly generated social contract theory. So it has it has a riptide. It has a lack of principles to avoid the negative consequences, where you go from a society that is all about rights and in an imbalanced way does not give duties, right? And then at the same time, when you press the security button, it's like a trap door, and all of those rights immediately go out without any way of controlling that in a nuanced legal and political way. I'm not saying that there's no nuance. I'm just saying it is a big problem, as theorists will acknowledge. Okay, so so that's the number one point, is that it's very clear. UN Resolution 242, 343. It was repeated many times, and it's been repeated in this long war, which is, as we know, has gone over a year now. That this land is yours. This land is yours, and don't fight. In 1977, point number two, a key thing to understand from Carter's book, the Likud party began to rise as demographics in Israel changed. So Menachem Begin led Israel towards a policy of refusing to exchange any land. So no more land for peace. We'll see that the founding documents of the Likud party are very clear in this regard, and they're still available for reading. So Anwar Sadat risked his life for peace. Begin also put a lot on the line, arguably more, actually. And Carter found Begin willing to return to a land for peace, at least verbally. But after signing, Begin turned his back not only on the agreement, but personally on Carter, wouldn't speak to him. So we call this new deal, and there are documents going around now of a clean break. They're recirculating, but we need to be aware that these documents are people's working documents at the end of the day, that are saying it's peace for peace now. There's no more land. We're not offering you anything. We can call this peace for peace. What does it mean? It means Israel uses its political control and superior military strength through, which would be impossible without the United States, to repress all opposition and exchange enough of a tolerable yet unpleasant existence in the occupied territories for peace that Israel so desperately needs. Now, after 1977, there are a number of historical twists and turns, some of which we'll narrate, and involving, very importantly, Yitzhak Rabin and the Oslo Accords, and ultimately what Carter's longtime aide and I don't remember if she actually became a cabinet member, but she worked in his administration, Mary Elizabeth King, who was at Oxford for a time, and I was made aware of her by Professor Avi Shlaim, whose works on this conflict are priceless. So the historical reflections on the 2 points that are made now, before getting to the third point, are there's no peace without, peace without a land exchange has never worked. It's never lasted. It's always broken down. And as Einstein stated, doing the same thing and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So Trump and there are a number of people now saying we're not going to rebuild Gaza until we have some kind of confirmation that this is going to last. We're not interested in spending $10 billion and then it's destroyed again. No, okay. So number 3, the United States is required to make this happen. Carter is very clear about why that is, so I'll let him say it in his own words. But I want to emphasize that he has this mediator mentality. And at the moment, what we have is something like 2 siblings that are locked into a fight, and they're desperate to get the ear of the lone superpower and to then force their view through on the other side through sheer power and support of that superpower. So Carter's found that there's no way without facing these jealous and anxious feelings. So for decades or even 100 years, Israel has had the ear of America through a lot of grassroots work initially. And, people are quick to point out AIPAC and ADL, but it's much more than that in America. And it's city by city. It's not just in Capitol Hill, right? So when Carter listened to the other side, what happened? I'm going to listen to the other side. Let me at least see what they're saying. Well, he's a bigot now, right? Because he repeats some of what that other side says. But like a man of God, he bore the difficulties of standing for the truth, right? Truth, justice, truth, justice, truth, justice, truth, justice, truth, justice. Everybody else and everything else can go, right? It's like Plato said, you can't harm the good man. You stand for truth and justice, then the worst thing that can happen to you is you can die. So, okay, so let's get back to Carter's summary now. And Paul, if you could, yeah.
There we go.
Right. So this was very early on. People mourning Carter's loss. Yeah, he's been immobile for a long time, but it brings it home when he's completely, at least physically, no longer with us. So I'm going to recap a few of the points from the previous recording so that this is coherent, because it's a very small percentage of the total material, such that this would stand alone for those that wish. So a couple of those facts that are needed for groundwork are that when Britain conducted a census in Palestine in 1922, there were around 84,000 Jews, 670,000 Arabs, of whom 71,000 were Christian. Now, I think this is already well into the migrations that had begun. Otherwise, the numbers would be quite different. And the Aliyats had already begun to have numbers like this, right? So by the time the area was partitioned by the United Nations, these numbers had grown to 600,000 Jews and 1.3 million Arabs. Okay, so 600,000 to 1.3 million, 10% of the Arabs being Christian. And during and after the 1948 war, around 420 Palestinian villages in the territory that were to become the state of Israel were destroyed, and some 700,000 Palestinian residents fled or were driven out. Now, we pick up where Carter takes his oath and begins his period in office. So 2 weeks later, he says, quoting from him now, President Sadat came to Washington. So during a long private conversation, it became obvious that his inclination to work with me on peace negotiations was already well developed. So that's now coming from him. Yeah, sorry, this is a slide on Mary Elizabeth King, Quiet Revolution, the First Palestinian Intifada, and non-violent resistance. We need to realize that these are stages that came before Hamas. And here's Carter's book. Let me pause the narrative and introduce the structure of the book very quickly here. Okay, so you can see it's a lot of chapters here even just on the first page. So prospects for peace. My first visit to Israel, that's when Golda Meir was the prime minister. We're going to see a list of the Israeli prime ministers in just a minute. His presidency begins in that year of 1977 when things were changing in Israel. And so then he narrates the conflict that he recognized by speaking to the key players in the region, right? So that chapter includes, of course, Israel, United States, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine. They're all people that they're all part of that players list that he introduces, that he interviews, and synthesizes what they say. Other neighbors, the Reagan years, and his visits with Palestinians. If we turn to the second, you can see that he goes straight through Clinton and Bush and the Geneva Initiative, and really right up to 2005, 2006, the building of the wall there, and a long list of appendices with historical documents, many of which he was a part of drafting or implementing or enforcing. Okay, so he himself was right in the middle of things. And it's not that he's a sort of extremely busy president and he has this one item on his list that he realizes is historically important. Rather, he had a lot of personal concern for the Holy Land. Before he took office, he'd already begun reading to inform himself about the realities there and the challenges. So if we look here, 1977, the person... So Yitzhak Rabin had a short term after Golda Meir, who invited him to the Holy Land, and Yitzhak Rabin, his name will appear later. But 1977, Begin comes in, and that is not listed purely as Likud party. It's a Harut Likud alliance, and even the name Likud is not always used. Sometimes it's a liberal party. Right, and yeah, so to his narrative, right, Sadat came and visited him. Menachem Begin replaced Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister 1 month later, and just to jump a tiny bit ahead in the narrative, as you could see in the presidents there, it's I'll get the exact year, but 1995, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated. And I'd like to make the point that I think everyone needs to know is, so number one, as Israeli newspapers reported, Ben-Gvir, who was a young man at that time, had this to say. So just like we got to the emblem of Rabin, we can get to Rabin. And Chris Hedges, who was family friends with Rabin and his wife, noted that his wife blames Benjamin Netanyahu for his death to this day. That's her narrative, because of the vitriolic rhetoric that was hyping people up to become angry and pop off. Finally, someone did pop off, right? But it went to the point that he paraded an effigy of Rabin in his coffin. So when the man is then assassinated after that, it's really no joking matter. Yeah. Okay, so Begin had put together a majority coalition that accepted the premise that the land of Gaza and the West Bank belonged rightfully to the state of Israel, in spite of Resolution 242, and should not be exchanged for a permanent peace agreement with the Arabs. Public opinion varied widely, but there was no doubt that in 1977, a more hawkish attitude now prevailed in the government of Israel. Age and ethnic differences strongly favored the Likud over the labor alignment. So it's very straightforward to see what they're about, right? The right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is eternal and indisputable and is linked with the right to security and peace. Therefore, Judea and Samaria, so we're not using the terms Gaza, East Jerusalem and West Bank. We're using the biblical terms for those lands as though no one lived in those lands in between. And I'd just like to remind everyone that it's not the Palestinians that evicted the Jews. If they had, it might make sense for the Jews to come back 1700 years later and say, out of my house. And in many cases, the houses that are there were not there at that. Well, yeah, I mean, not that land was not even arable. It's not. These points, I hear people argue about them, but there's just utter kind of ignorance of basic facts. And it's something that's worth getting to know from a trusted source, right? So these lands will not be handed to any foreign administration. Between the sea and the Jordan River, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. As you know, the Israeli Constitution is online. You can see now that it says Jewish autonomy and sovereignty is what is constitutional only, right? So it doesn't mean that they don't allow other people to live there and work there, etc. But that doesn't qualify as a liberal democracy. There, as someone pointed out, Iran and Saudi Arabia don't have constitutions like that. Right? So I don't know if Imam Tom mentioned something like that as well. Yeah, just point B here. A plan which relinquishes any of these undermines our rights to the country. And unavoidably leads to a Palestinian state. So while the rhetoric, and we don't have time to comment on all these things, unfortunately, but the rhetoric has always been, no, I do want a two-state solution, but then it's undermined with poison pills at every stage, right? Or there's an attempt to blame the other side. Then finally, Netanyahu comes out with, no, I actually never wanted a two-state solution. So, you're going to get lied to if you, unfortunately, and he's not, whatever popularity I think that he has in Israel is just out of the security issue. So the PLO is referred here as an organization of assassins that want to liquidate the state of Israel. None of this is true. And up top, the focal point for the Zionist effort is to redeem the country. That's what the JNF does, the Jewish National Fund. So lots of money from a very large organization, which shows you that it's not a state aiming for the common good of all of those who are living there. Yeah, I mean, the sentiment of many in America will say, well, they need to be protected. That's true, but how do you do that? You can't. You have to get into details. Right. So the state of Israel should not exchange Gaza and the West Bank for peace with the Arabs. Public opinion varied widely. Likud party came in, and what Carter says is part of the cause here is Oriental Jews whose families had come from the Middle East and Africa gave the Likud coalition parties a margin. That's where the margin came from, is the Sephardic or Oriental Jews who had lived with the Arabs for hundreds or in many cases over 1,000 years. And they were inclined to support a much more militant policy in dealing with the occupied territories. Now, this is one of these areas that's very telling for one to look into. I'm going to summarize it and just say that the Sephardic Jews initially are much more sympathetic to Palestinians because they have lived alongside of them. What I believe, and I'm happy to look at this as something to research further, is that when they live inside Israel and they are treated as second or third class citizens compared to the Ashkenazis, they attempt to assimilate. So they want to change their way of dress, their language, which can be they can be ashamed of it in many cases, even if they, try and have a pride in their identity. But when the Arabs, in official documents are made into this universal enemy, which again, there's good academic research on that, that it is a part of the education system. If you are an Arab background Jew, how are you going to feel in all of that, right? So what you'll notice is that there's a certain date where you see these costumes and clothing coming out, and you won't see it as vividly after that. And it's to the point that some people would now argue that that they are almost completely assimilated into the Israeli society. And instead, you will see the Haredi or Haredi and the Dati and the Masorti and the Hiloni. You'll see these names, which are more of a political or religious alignment. And it's not purely religious and it's not purely political. It's a mixture, right? And Paul, I think some of your previous presenters have spoken about how religious Zionism came about, in spite of the fact that initially Herzl's Zionism was extremely secular and even, it very much looked down on the Orthodox Jews as the cause of the backwardness of the Jewish race, etc. Okay, so that was a reality at the time. It's shifted now to this demographics, and Carter talks about Begin carrying on from there and says, Begin and his family suffered persecution in Eastern Europe and Siberia for his political activism as a Zionist. He was released from a Soviet prison and went to Palestine in 1942 and became the leader of a militant underground group called the Irgun, which espoused the maximum demands for Zionism. These included driving the British forces out of Palestine. He fought with every weapon available against the British, who branded him the preeminent terrorist in the region. A man of personal courage, Carter says, and single-minded devotion to his goals, he took pride in being a fighting Jew. Still, Carter found Begin willing to discuss the major goals of peace and began working with Sadat on that. The most infamous episode was the bombing of the King David Hotel. I think it's 92 guests were killed in that. And I think there's a strong historical argument for terrorism being introduced to the Islamic world through Palestine, through Russian immigrants. I can't confirm that right now, but I believe that someone's made a strong argument for it. And I wonder if Avi Shleim deals with that claim. Yeah, and it's worth noting that there's a book, The Army Like No Other, where it makes the point that the Irgun, Haganah, and there's one other group, right, that there was no government at one point. These three groups made a government around their military groups. Right. So in the Camp David Accords, the premise when these three men met, the premise was that Egypt was a step towards a solution with the Palestinians. Peace with Egypt was. And Begin insisted that the document should not merely state autonomy for the Palestinians, but full autonomy. In other words, to govern yourselves how you wish. So it's to be remembered that the Camp David Accords, signed by Sadat and Begin and officially ratified by both governments, reconfirmed a specific commitment to honor UN Resolution 242 and 383, which prohibit the acquisition of land by force and call for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories, military occupation, right? So the Camp David Accords are printed in the book, and you can look into this. Maybe we could share the slides, but the point is that it is very explicit about the peace with Egypt being a step, and the intention is to work out the details and complete a two-state solution. It's a stepping stone, and that's agreed to in the Camp David Accords. And there are many other things in here that are very important and telling. So as I mentioned, Paul, I'm happy to share a slide deck, right? So furthermore, the Accords generally recognize that continuing to treat, and these statements are in it, right? Continuing to treat non-Jews in the occupied territories as a substratum of society is contrary to the principles of morality and justice on which democracies are founded. So Begin and Sadat agreed that apparently insurmountable problems concerning Palestinian rights would be overcome. And Sadat, as a result of this agreement, was condemned, and for a long time, neither the Jordanians nor the PLO were willing to participate in peace talks, confirming Israel's fears that their nation's existence would be threatened in the future. That does not remain the case with the PLO, right? So for Menachem Begin, the peace treaty with Egypt was the significant act for Israel. And in my own copy, I've emphasized that it's the peace treaty with Egypt that was for him the significant act. While solemn promises that are in that accord that can be read in the book regarding the West Bank and Palestinians would be finessed, Carter's trying to be polite here, or deliberately violated. With the bilateral treaty, Israel removed Egypt's considerable strength from the military equation of the Middle East, and thus it permitted itself renewed freedom to pursue the goals of a fervent and dedicated minority of its citizens to confiscate, settle, and fortify the occupied territories. Israeli settlement activity still caused great concern, and in 1980, UN Resolution 465, which is printed in Carter's book as Appendix number 5, calling on Israel to dismantle existing settlements in the Arab territories occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, was passed. So, the table of contents and all the appendices are part of the slide deck. It's not an expensive book either. So let us remember, if we are one of these people that have been trained to say, well, the United Nations is, sometimes it's a terrible organization, sometimes it's a great organization, and just fire from the hip as kind of populist politics give us the right to do. Why was the United Nations founded? To avoid something like the Holocaust happening again, and to make a collective supra-state power to protect those in states from states. So 1948, the Nakba happens. So very shortly after it's put in place, it's violated. And who is it violated by? It's violated by those who it was put in place to protect. And then they're undermining the United Nations as an evil organization. At least that's the rhetoric of Netanyahu, and in the conversations that he has with I believe it's Rebbe is how his name is said, but the great rabbi who's actually buried in New York, not in Israel. He told him that it's dark and he has to kind of go up against it and challenge it. These are just realities that are recorded. These conversations are very often recorded. Now, Carter carries on. We all knew that Israel must have a comprehensive and lasting peace, and this dream could not be realized if Israel. It could have been realized had they complied with the Camp David Accords and refrained from illegal colonizing of the West Bank, and with Arabs accepting Israel within its legal borders, which at some point not long after that, the PLO accepts, right? So Carter's own summary at the closing of the book then gives us the full trajectory that we need to have in front of us when we're trying to understand his overall message. So he picks up from that peace treaty with Egypt that we just discussed, and he makes the following points. So in general, excessive blood has been spilled in the Holy Land since that 1979 peace treaty with Egypt. This spilling of blood was unnecessary as there was a core of common elements found in the agreements of 1974, 1978, 1982, 1993, 1994, 2002, 2003. They all have the same elements, which are now being ignored, I believe, right? Upon which lasting peace could easily have been built. And through this direct and persistent, through his direct and persistent involvement, Carter concludes that the cycle of violence is perpetuated through these four elements. Some Israelis, and keep in mind he's starting from 1977. This was not always the case. But from that point forward, some Israelis believe that they have the right to confiscate and colonize the land and subjugate and persecute hopeless and aggravated Palestinians, and B, some Palestinians who honored suicide bombers as martyrs and consider killing Israelis a victory. Then Israel responds with retribution and oppression, and some Palestinian militants do not recognize Israel. And the way out of the cycle is a peace process. But the United States has abandoned the effort. And so it's ad nauseum from there, right? So three other important points that are priceless in Carter's book is that, unlike many people who've written on the topic, Carter allows both sides to speak for themselves. And so, for instance, he quotes, right, Yasser Arafat. So he spoke to Yasser Arafat without being murdered. He must have been a very lucky person, right? When I met Yasser Arafat in 1990, he stated, "The PLO has never advocated the annihilation of Israel. The Zionists started the drive the Jews into the sea slogan and attributed it to the PLO." Okay, now you might say, well, that doesn't mean it's true, but let's look at official PLO documents. Let's look for evidence of this in history. And I do know that people have found the slogan floating around amongst other people, but I don't believe that it was ever the official PLO slogan, or even, even something that they wanted to do. I mean, Jews have been living alongside Muslims in these areas for as long as there have been Jews and Muslims. It is a new attitude that is now prevailing, and it needs to be called out for everyone's sake. And so there is, there's comment that's needed on this, but it takes when you read the historians who write on this, they will, many of them being Jewish historians, they will say that Menachem Begin was incapable of assessing enemies due to fear. So, that's something that you can sympathize with, but it means that, again, that the United States needs to be firm and proactive and not sit around and wait for approval of their interference. And that's a touchy one, right? And I appreciate that. And you can only intervene and overcome other people's autonomy. But of course, Palestinian autonomy is utterly overridden. So there's no balance in the situation. The second point that he mentions is that the Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan could quote the latest figures on how much Palestinian family land was being confiscated by Israel's military authorities. And the figures gathered through his research claimed that the societal structure of non-Jews was being changed methodically from family farming and free enterprise into day labor, with Palestinians becoming increasingly dependent on menial household jobs and other work for Israelis. So when we now look and say, these Palestinians that they haven't developed their country and they need the high-tech center in Israel to get jobs and support themselves, that is not genuine. And it's not enough to say, oh, I say Salaam alaikum to my Arab neighbors, but then I laugh at them for being coming into my house and cleaning and fixing my pipes and my toilet and things like that. Those are the people that would have been the landowners in the past. Those are the people that would have had ships coming and going from Haifa. And as the Irgun and Haganah said when they chased people out of Haifa, right, that these people lived like Europeans. Their daughters were beautiful, right? They wore attractive clothing. And I don't want to talk about what happened as those people were driven out. It's horrible. And in many cases, they say it in their own voices in the videos, which are available on the internet, and laugh while they're describing it. So number 3, Carter devotes so there's the wall in the background, which might be lost. Carter devotes a full chapter to the wall that surrounds the illegal settlements in the West Bank. And he sees this as part of Israel avoiding the illegal settlements in the West Bank. So he sees it as part of Israel avoiding the peace process. So let's enact something that, I say it and it requires more nuance, but we don't have time. This wall is in, I can't remember if it's in one or both, but Ben-Gurion and Jacobitsky's plans for how to implement this, right? There already is a discussion of an iron wall that must exist between the two bodies. Now, people will say contemporary Zionists are not committed to everything that the early Zionists were committed to. It just makes it hard to swallow that when what we're looking at are things that were described in their works. It's avoiding the quartet's roadmap to peace as well. Utilizing their political and military dominance, they're imposing a system of partial withdrawal, encapsulation, and apartheid on the Muslim and Christian citizens of the occupied territories. The driving purpose, and these are passages that very much upset people in Carter's book, and apartheid on the Muslim. The driving purpose for the forced separation of the two peoples is, unlike that in South Africa, not racism, but the acquisition of land. So what's between the lines there is that the security issue would not be an issue if the peace process was followed. And the years that Carter visited Palestine when Golda Meir was there, he said people were mixing with each other, relaxed. There was not a need for everything to be governed by security and CCTV cameras. And the borders were open and thriving, and there was a lot of trade and tourism and people coming and going. That ends when you start pushing for the settlement of the West Bank, and you don't give up the military occupation. So as he said, a Jewish family can commute from Jerusalem to their highly subsidized home deep in the West Bank on roads from which others are excluded, without ever coming into contact with any facet of Arab life. In Carter's opinion, the status of this barrier is a key to future peace in the Middle East. So here are Palestinians living in the shadow of this wall. The barrier, which is 3.5 times as long as the internationally recognized border itself, is based on the wall surrounding Gaza, which was said to have decreased Cross-border raids. Yeah, I'm going to avoid the temptation to comment and leave time at the end, hopefully, Paul. So President George Bush said, I think this wall is a problem. It's very difficult to develop confidence between the Palestinians and the Israelis with the wall snaking through the West Bank. And the only comment I'll make is that when Israelis have power and maintain an occupation, there's a responsibility that they have to govern all the citizens that are in that territory. So if you have so much rancor and distrust of people that you're going to mistreat them, then you need to cease to be responsible for them and allow them to have their autonomy. And instead of the United States sending all this money for Iron Dome and David's sling and Yaqub's belt or a sphere, whatever the new names they come up with, Jericho and whatever, why don't they just enforce a peace? Why don't they make Jerusalem a place? I mean, yeah, as we'll get to, under Ottoman control, under all these other controls, anyone in the world that wanted to come and visit the Holy Land was able to, right? So I'll allow Carter to express that himself. So you can see the length of the wall. It's, as they said, 3.5 times as long as the border itself. So to build the wall, a wide swathe must be bulldozed through communities before the wall can be built. In July 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled that the building of the wall must cease, and what remains of it must be dismantled, and it ruled to compensate Palestinians for the losses of their land, their trees, etc. The wall ravages many places along its devious route, and this is all with quotation marks directly from the book, that are important to Christians. In addition to enclosing Bethlehem in one of its most notable intrusions, an especially heartbreaking division is on the southern slope of the Mount of Olives, a favorite place for Jesus, upon him be peace, and his disciples, and very near Bethany, where they often visited Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. There is a church named for one of the sisters, Santa Marta Monastery, where Israel's 30-foot concrete wall cuts through the property. The house of worship is now on the Jerusalem side, and its parishioners are separated from it because they cannot get permits to enter Jerusalem. Its priest, Father Claudio Gilardi, says, for 900 years, we've lived here under Turkish, British, Jordanian, and Israeli governments, and no one has ever stopped people coming to pray. It's scandalous. This is not a barrier, it's a border. Why don't they speak the truth? Yeah, and one of the times that I sat with Professor Avi was when we received a delegation of priests from Jerusalem, and I'd be happy to discuss that. So in addition to cutting off about 200,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem from their relatives, their properties, their schools, their businesses, the wall is designed to complete the enclosure of a severely truncated Palestine, a small portion of its original size, compartmentalized, divided into cantons, occupied by Israeli security forces and isolated from the outside world. What I understand is you have to have permits to get back and forth between the little Bantustans or cantons that are divided up, and this can often be a great headache, almost impossible. And isolated from the outside world. In addition, a network of exclusive highways is being built across even these fragments of the West Bank to connect the new Greater Israel in the west with the occupied Jordan River Valley in the east, where 7,000 Jews are living in 21 at his time 21, I'm not sure what it is now, protected settlements among about 50,000 Palestinians who are still permitted to stay there. The area along the Jordan River, which is now planned as the eastern leg of the encirclement of the Palestinians, is one of Palestine's most lucrative and productive agricultural regions. So most of the inhabitants were forcefully evicted in 1967. So again, when I speak to Americans about this, they will immediately say, well, what do you mean? It was kind of an unarable desert, and Israel built it into this great nation and farms and irrigation and developed it. Before that, it was mostly desert, right? Well, no. So all the way leading down to what is the Dead Sea, right? The Jordan River runs into the Dead Sea. It was very arable land, and I forget what the statistic was. Something like 800,000 olive trees have been chopped down. How much land does it take to have 800,000? How much irrigation is required? And the city of Jerusalem is a city of scholars and piety going back hundreds of years. I meant to bring it with me, but I have a Brill publication which lists all of the guilds that were there in medieval Jerusalem. I mean, this was a very serious medieval city, and the vast majority of those guilds are Muslim. That's not the end of the point. Many of them are Christian. Some of them are Jewish. They're not slitting each other's throats, but it's a very developed city. It's a microcosm of all of the trades and knowledges and sciences that were there. The architecture is beautiful. That's why to this day real estate agents are happy to take these houses which have Arabic inscriptions on the stones and whatnot. I'm very tempted to buy a ticket and go do some filming. So most of its inhabitants were forcefully evicted in 1967, and the Israelis have not allowed these original families to return. Israeli customs officers keep lists of their names and are careful to prohibit their crossing any international checkpoint into the occupied territory where they might lay claim to their homes and farmlands. And as Carter says, the best description of the barrier, its routing and impact is shown in the film The Iron Wall, produced by the Palestinian Agricultural Relief Committees. It's available at PARC, from PARC, just an acronym for the previous phrase, at www.theironwall.ps/, and it's in his book, of course. So I want to give a glimpse of the Carter himself summarizes the books. It's good to let him do that. Part of it will make us repeat his statement of the cycle of distrust, where he does indeed say that the United States is effectively the cause by abandoning the peace efforts. But he adds things that I didn't pull up into the earlier summaries in his actual summary, page 208 to 210. So number one, the security of Israel must. So the peace negotiations have three requirements. The security of Israel must be guaranteed. The internal debate in Israel over its permanent legal boundary must be resolved. And that is an internal debate, but as we saw, someone like Donald Trump can force people to be reasonable in 24 hours, where they will drag their feet for years while people are dying every day. And C, the sovereignty of all Middle East nations and the sanctity of international borders must be honored. Commenting on the third point, Carter says the overriding problem is that for more than a quarter of a century, the actions of some Israeli leaders have been in direct conflict with the official policies of the United States. And you can add Obama and all kinds of people after Clinton, after the Bushes, and their own negotiated agreements, as we've seen here, right? Regardless of whether Palestinians had no formalized government, one headed by Yasser Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas, or one which Abbas as president and Hamas as controlling the parliament and cabinet, Israel's continued control and colonization of Palestinian land, these two have been the primary obstacles to a comprehensive peace agreement in the Holy Land. In order to perpetuate the occupation, Israeli forces have deprived their unwilling subjects of basic human rights. No objective person could personally observe existing conditions, which Carter did, drove around and over the decades as well, repeated his visits in the West Bank and dispute these statements, right? So when people like Tucker Carlson bring out some of the truth, they are abused in the worst of terms. And there's something not gentlemanly about this, right? Now, gentlemen will go out and duel in the old days, right? But they don't just utterly undermine each other in a way that is actually tapping into the worst elements of cancel culture and political wars, right? Where you won an all-out war, an all-out victory. You imagine that the liberals are going to destroy the conservatives, or the conservatives are going to eliminate the liberals, right? At least that's how it kind of plays out in the United States. There's just a bit of a confusion about who's the cowboys and who are the Indians these days. So Carter adds two other interrelated factors that have contributed to the perpetuation of violence and regional upheaval. A condoning of illegal Israeli actions from a submissive White House, and B, a U.S. Congress during recent years, and the deference with which the other international leaders permit this unofficial U.S. policy in the Middle East to prevail. So it is just impotency and lack of taking responsibility. So there are constant and vehement political and media debates in Israel itself. It's a very lively debate concerning its policies in the West Bank. But because of powerful political, economic, and regional forces in the United States, Israeli government decisions are rarely questioned or condemned in the United States, right? Voices from Jerusalem dominate our media, Carter says. And most American citizens are unaware of the circumstances of the occupied territories. And this is why I'm saying that this book is so valuable, because he turns over all the major stones that are left unturned by people that are either afraid to do so. I'm not sure really why it is. This is a reference to that poll that he mentioned. So at the same time, political leaders and news media in Europe are highly critical of Israeli policies, affecting public attitudes. Americans were surprised and angered by an opinion poll published by the International Herald Tribune in 2003 of 7,500 citizens of 15 European nations, indicating Israel was considered to be the top threat to world peace, ahead of North Korea, Iran, and Afghanistan, right? They're not saying what people might think that they're saying. All that they're saying is that the way that they handle matters can actually be the match that lights the stick of dynamite that is World War III. So and being heavy-handed with one's neighbors and then hiding behind the United States. Some people are more cynical than that and would say that they're a proxy of the United States. I will draw my line of commentary somewhere, right? So the United States has used its UN Security Council veto more than 40 times to block resolutions critical of Israel. Some of these vetoes have brought international discredit to the United States, and there's little doubt that the lack of a persistent effort to resolve the Palestinian issue is a major source of anti-American sentiment and terrorist activity throughout the Middle East and the Islamic world. So A, he's taking responsibility, and B, I've seen the statistics coming out about the effects on American corporations of people boycotting Starbucks and 4, 5, 6 other big companies. They've taken very big hits overseas. They're closing, their branches are empty. And, why would people want to go eat hamburgers from someone who's, one-sidedly killing their brothers and sisters? And the whole media element has really blurred things. And I'd recommend that everybody watch, I think it's called Atrocity.Inc. Atrocity Inc. by I'm gonna try and remember his name. Should have it on the tip of my tongue. But he's the Jewish investigative journalist who's really been fantastic and has really called out a lot of the claims about October 7th. And the point is not to have denial either way. You have to follow the evidence. But some people are so emotionally committed to either their demonization or denial. So to achieve its goals, Israel has decided to avoid peace negotiations, take unilateral action to escape the mild restraints, America slapping their hand a little bit, and carved out choice pieces of the West Bank for itself, leaving Palestinians destitute within a small and fragmented remnant of their original land. The holding of 10,000 Arab prisoners and a destructive military response to the capture of 3 Israeli soldiers has aroused global concerns about the hair-trigger possibility of regional war being launched. So in Carter's time, 10,000 Arab prisoners. You can look at Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and others for the number that are held without a legal process. If someone is held in a prison, often in solitary confinement or under very difficult conditions without a legal warrant, what is the difference between that and taking a captive? The difference is the pirate and the emperor, right? The emperor can do it with a pseudo legal apparatus, whereas the pirate is seen as an outlaw. But what they're doing is pretty much the same. So, and obviously, you can see Carter. He's almost predicting October 7th here. And if you ask. Well, one of the stated goals of October 7th is to take prisoners because they no one listens to them. They have their once you classify someone as a terrorist organization, the door is open for you to mistreat them how you like, and all the people who are under their there's no formal legal process by which those people. By which a Palestinian can raise the point. I do know that that requires further discussion. Now, turning, and we're just about to start wrapping down here. So turning now to Carter's afterward, alluding to the backlash he received for his outspoken position, he states, "Nobody enjoys being called ugly names, but what I've experienced is of little importance." This is a big man with a big, it's of little importance compared to the half-century of suffering, death, and persecution and fear experienced by the people of Israel and Palestine. The people of Jerusalem, Gaza, and Ramallah have been shown in polls for decades to want peace. 60% of the Israeli public approve of the exchange of land for peace, and a January poll in 2006 indicates 81% of Palestinians want the same. There are few exceptions. We have seen the prospects of peace largely decline since the treaty between Israel and Egypt, achieved by the courage of Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin 28 years ago. Yitzhak Rabin was another hero, and like Sadat, was assassinated because he was a man of peace. History has shown that progress is possible only if the United States assumes its historic role of an honest broker. To play this essential role, coming back to one of the 3 historical points needed for going forward without a disaster, America must not be seen as in the pocket of either side. We must enjoy a degree of trust and respect from both sides. So again, watch the Thomas Massey interview with Tucker Carlson if you want to know what goes on in the Congress right now. He must always make, if you claim to be a patriotic American and want to know what's going on in your country, watch it. So we must always make clear our commitment to the security of Israel. But we cannot be peacemakers if American government leaders are seen as knee-jerk supporters of every action or policy of whatever Israeli government happens to be in power at the moment. So how low will you go? Well, we'll go as low as we're required to. Just, whatever government, that's what we do. This is the essential fact that must be faced. A powerful factor, especially in the political arena, is the domineering influence of the American-Israeli Public Committee Affairs, AIPAC, which exercises, as Carter says here, its legitimate goal of defending the policies of Israel's most conservative governments and arouses maximum support in our country. Under AIPAC pressure, there are few significant countervailing voices in the public arena, and any balanced debate is still practically non-existent in the United States Congress and other presidential hopefuls. The American Friends of Israel who demand such subservience are in many cases sincere and well-intentioned people. But in this crucial issue, they are tragically mistaken against their own best interest. Their demands subvert America's ability to bring to Israelis what they most desperately need and want: peace and security within recognized borders. Today, the growth of Islamic extremism and the unprecedented hostility towards America in the Islamic world is directly related to the continuing bloodshed between Israelis and Palestinians. To think otherwise is foolish and dangerous. Okay, so instead of Daniel Pipes and Benjamin Netanyahu in 1981 creating a new enemy for America to fight, right? If you watch the Rambo movies, I don't know if it's Rambo 1, Rambo 2, he's rah-rahing with the Afghanis against, right? And as Texan Senator Ron Paul said, America radicalized the Islamic world. It's just one of these, points that's so hard to just get your head around when you first hear it. But it's true, right? And in a matter of years, right, these people were turned into demons and or they were demonized. I'm not, I'm only making the point that I'm making. I'm not, and I don't have time to explain all the possibilities for it. But I just want to end here with Jimmy Carter's own prayer, as he says, "My prayer on behalf of the children of the Holy Land and America is for the gift of courage to Israel, courage to Israeli and Palestinian leaders, but particularly to our elected officials of both parties at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. The courage to face the facts and do what is necessary to return America to its honored and historic role as peacemaker. Jimmy Carter, signed as though it's with his blood, May 2007. That's what he gave his life for. And beautiful and important book. Makes so many nuanced points without which there is confusion reigning on these topics. So we do ask for his spirit in that sense to find peace and us having the success to work towards peace.
Okay, is that the end of these slides?
That's the end of the slides. Yeah, there.
So,
these. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'll put them back up again. Yeah.
Well, yeah. At various points, right? I had talked about the suffering that the Palestinians undergo, and the point, people have to see it, but we had to draw the line somewhere, Paul. So that's where I drew it. So hopefully you could edit out some of these.
Okay. No, that's good. Well, thank you very much indeed for that magisterial survey of Carter's views and the wider geopolitical realities in which we currently exist, of course. And I mean, I can't help be mindful of what happened in the last 24 hours, actually, where the the new UN ambassador, the nominee at the hearing in Washington, Stefanik, who was asked if she still backs Israel's so-called right to occupy the West Bank, and this is based on the so-called biblical principle. And she said, yes, she does. This is the new United Nations representative of the United States. So we now know what the United States government thinks, that it's a biblical right for Israel to occupy Palestine. But what struck me about that, it's not just the West Bank. That's specifically what it was being referenced. But of course, for people, the biblical Jews, the biblical Christians, for them, the greater Israel is not just the West Bank. It's also Jordan, it's Egypt, it's Syria, it's Lebanon, it's parts of Iraq. I mean, it's a massive imperial project to take over a huge amount of the Middle East. If you're going to go down that path of the biblical thing, we're not just dealing with the West Bank, we're dealing with a massive imperial expansion of military power backed by the United States. Now, this is the stuff of nightmares, and it's just what staggers belief that the current regime in Washington imperial regime actually supports this publicly, openly, on the very lips of their new representative. This is I think Carter would be extremely alarmed by this development. Do you not think?
He would, of course. I've heard about this pronouncement. Haven't had the time to research it, but I've been very tempted, Paul, to put together the biblical case. I know that you had Dr. Ali Ata'i on, and he very capably went through the biblical sources for that. So I think that it is a political theology. I think that it's you need the Schofield Bible. You need and I'm speaking specifically about the Christian argument. I would love to have Dr. Gary Burge and others who are experts on this topic go through it if you don't think that it's been addressed sufficiently in the past, right? But just to put together all the biblical verses and show that, even in the Old Testament, right? So Ezekiel, with the fall of Jerusalem, very much states that it's because we did X, Y, Z, R, Q that we're being ejected into diaspora. I can't help but mention that it's Islam that allowed them to come out of bondage, right? So they were basically in and allowed those who wished to come back and rebuild and worship and clean up the temple, right? So that all happened within the early caliphs of Islam. So in other words, they were in Babylon and Iraq, and they were released from that and given a legal status and allowed to settle anywhere that they wished in the Islamic world, not only in ghettos as they eventually were in Europe. So it's just good to mention that. But I'm very happy to speak to everyone on their own principles. I think if we think that way, we'll be all right. So if you want to start from Christian principles, let's follow it all the way to the end. And I think people need to know. Would you consider that that's already been addressed sufficiently?
Yeah, by Ali Ata'i, as you say, on several very popular, very extensive and expansive programs on blogging theology, for sure. It's just this key point. I mean, last night, by the way, there's further news. According to the Guardian, some so-called Israeli settlers entered into the West Bank, smashing cars, burning property, and so on, after Trump announced he was lifting sanctions on the violent settlers. So this is a green light for the settlers to go in and literally invade and take property, homes. Even a nursery was attacked. Innocent people were killed. 8 people have died so far. And this is a direct consequence of Trump lifting these sanctions on these violent terrorist settler groups. And this has happened in the last 24 hours of his presidency. So yes. It's but really, really quite extraordinary, I think. But the thing about the New Testament that struck me about, Christian support for Israel in the New Testament, if you read it, and I've actually read it, the New Testament, the new Israel is based around faith. It's based around faith in Christ, and it's a majoritarian Gentile faith. It's not based on geographical territory anymore. That's the old Israel, the old dispensation, the Old Testament idea. The New Testament doesn't have a territorial, it has an eschatological spiritual dominion. And that's the new Israel that Paul talks about. It's simply not equivalent in any shape or form conceivable with the state of Israel today, which is a secular Jewish nationalist state, which is not Christian. It just, Israel does not acknowledge Jesus as the Christ. I mean, everyone knows that. Therefore, it's not Israel, according to, say, Paul in Romans, in his absolutely magisterial letter, the most influential thing he ever wrote in the New Testament. It talks about this in chapters, I forget which chapters 7, 8, 9, explicitly. And, it's clear it's no longer a territorial, geographical state at all. It's a spiritual communion of Christians now. So this whole idea that somehow Christianity supports the secular state of Israel is really bizarre. And you mentioned the Schofield Bible, but this is not grafted naturally on what Paul says at all. It's a very alien, odd idea that's somehow imported into the New Testament, in my view.
Part of the argument is that Schofield is trying to say that they never obtained the land that they were promised, so they're still waiting for the fulfillment, and and again, I think Dr. Adi has shown in a number of verses that that's just anti-biblical, right? I wanted to mention that also in the Gospel of John, there's a reference. Perhaps it's when there's the discussion of a Roman spearing Jesus, and he says, and he says what he means is that his body is the temple, right? So it's as you said, Jesus is the temple. That's how he says it can be rebuilt in 3 days, etc. Because he's saying he is the new temple. That's right. And then there's the whole discussion of what we call dispensation. What's the term, Paul?
Dispensationalism. Yeah.
Yes, but that each dispensation revokes the previous, right? And so that's why I'd like either to explore these issues more
supersessionism. Sorry, supersessionism.
Yeah,
and that's been the standard Christian view since the beginning. It's there in Ignatius of Antioch in the beginning of the 2nd century. That Christianity has replaced Judaism. You no longer follow Judaism, you follow Christianity. And Christianity is not centered on a state of Israel. It's centered on Christ, the church, the sacraments, the heavenly Jerusalem. It's there in the book of Revelation, the heavenly Jerusalem. It's not really centered on some kind of physical political entity with an army that rejects Jesus, because Jews in secular reject Jesus. They don't acknowledge him at all. So there's no relationship with Christianity whatsoever. It's an unbelieving state that needs to be converted to Jesus as the Messiah. So.
Right. So, I mean, as you know, with Christian Zionism, then there is a belief that perhaps some of these Jews will convert to Christianity at the end. So they do accept some elements that this has to be centered, and certain things have to happen in historical Israel for the second coming. So, again, if you don't think that those issues have all been sufficiently dealt with, I know there are new arguments as well that Dr. Gary Birch in some of his books addresses, and but again, it's like Schofield, right? It's as long as someone is being funded to search for things, they can create more political theologies and squirm out of certain arguments. But as you said, I don't see it as legitimate on its own terms, right? These are your principles. This is your scripture. It says what it says, and it's relatively clear. And it's unfortunate that it's not easier to spread truth and justice. Ideology has a very strong hand right now, but that's why your channel and whatever efforts are possible, they're valuable, and hopefully people will listen. And if not, then it's a matter of testification, right?
I think though people have listened, are listening, and get it and agree, because most of the world, as far as I can see, does see what you're saying. It's not like most of the world don't get it. Most of the world do get it. It's a minority of the world that refuse to get it, and that minority is centered around Western Europe and most of the United States and a few other bits and pieces, maybe Australia. But the vast majority of the planet, the United Nations, the countries of the world, international organizations, they all get it. People get it. It's just they don't have power, because power is centered around, even more so, Make America Great Again. Now this renewed imperial project to dominate the planet in the name of American nationalism. But people get it. most people do. It's just they don't have the power yet. But one day, inshallah, things will change, because history is always changing. Things never remain static. It's one thing, amazing thing about our space-time continuing. It's not rigid and fixed. It's always developing. So I think eventually we will see a change of the profoundest kind, and justice will be done. But not today. It'll have to wait for another day. Certainly not while Trump is in power. But it will happen. I'm sure of that, God willing.
God willing. I mean, we might, I don't know, we might still be surprised at what happens with Trump, or maybe whatever it is that happens will somehow be a stepping stone, in the divine wisdom for something else. But it is there is a certain amount of etiquette due to power, and power only understands its own prerogatives, and sometimes it is good to point out that if you are a person that is committed to that wider Western project to the hilt completely, and even within the Republican Party, it's like you said, it's not very clear. How do you combine liberal international order with citing the Bible, especially out of context, right? How are you integrating reason and revelation by doing that? Do you know what it is that you're integrating? Is that actually reason, right? Is contemporary liberal democracy and its bases, someone like Richard Rorty would say that it's just a pragmatic agreement of the will for people to. But the point that I want to make is speak to them to ourselves, if we're living in that and committed to it. They're accelerating the global South, not only wanting to escape from their power, but as many of them have said, if we are going to eventually decline with regards to the Chinese economy and whatnot, then let us export our values, and our values as a civilization can carry on. But people are going to be having problems with that. You have, I'll just allude to where people can go with this. And again, I think people like Dr. Hassan Spiker have gone into this, but you have books like Lacerdo's writings on liberalism that it was never really a universal principle. Even John Locke and then later people, there were always people like the Catholics and others who were excluded. Initially, women, of course, excluded, and and people like de Tocqueville speak about the followers of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was a great Sufi, great scholar, but he lived on horseback, so he didn't have this image of a European gentleman. He didn't have ruffles on his on his sleeves, and so he said he and his followers should be starved to death. That's de Tocqueville, right? So it's just so that's my only point, is that if you don't extinguish this dark side of liberalism and take the best of it and make something good out of it, the values, people will accelerate the end of that project too, right? And I can't help but see how quick people are to say that the secular order wants to remove all religion, but now we see religion coming back in the hands of people in power, and it's acceptable. It's fine now for people to be crazy right wing and quote things, as we said, that are political theologies. They're not even real theologies. So it's just two-facedness. It's not a principle. When it doesn't apply to everyone, it's not a principle. When it's not a principle, then it's not a set of ideals that anyone can live under and that are workable. It's not even working right now. So anyway. Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Well, maybe that's a good place to conclude the discussion. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Stephen Steyer, as I say, for your magisterial survey of the issues, and you're remembering the legacy of President Jimmy Carter, recently deceased, who stood for a different world, a different sense of justice and values for all people, perhaps, unlike the current regime, which is totally one-sided. So it's good to remember him and to reignite the flame of hope that he ignited for all those years, particularly in the United States, where it's needed most, I think.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. Hopefully his life was not in vain, and hopefully the Carter Center. And thank you for having me, Paul, and thank you for bringing out inspiring discussion here.
Thank you very much. So take care until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks, Paul. Take care.